My name is Natalie Harper. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my career, I've been the woman in the room people forget to be threatened by. I work in data security and compliance. One of those roles that sounds technical enough to earn polite respect, but quiet enough to fade into the background during meetings. I've always been measured, soft-spoken, organized, the kind of person who takes notes when others perform, the kind of person who remembers what was said long after everyone else has moved on. Most people mistake that for passivity. At work, I was known as dependable, thorough, low drama. If something needed to be documented, verified, or archived, I handled it. I didn't interrupt. I didn't compete for attention. I didn't need applause. And in environments driven by ego and urgency, that made me easy to underestimate. What no one understood was this: I notice everything. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about humiliation or shouting or dramatic showdowns. It's about what happens when someone decides you are the safest person to blame. It's about the morning I was accused of stealing confidential company data, and how the person who filed the complaint before I could defend myself was the one who had been copying my hard drive at midnight. But if you're expecting a cinematic confrontation, you won't find it here. What you'll hear instead is the slow shift of power, the quiet recalibration of truth, the kind of justice that unfolds without spectacle. Because when I was called into that conference room and told there was a formal complaint against me, filed by my own manager, I didn't panic, I didn't cry, I didn't argue. I listened. And while they spoke, I realized something important. The only reason someone rushes to accuse is that they're afraid of what you might reveal. This is the story of how I went from invisible to untouchable, without raising my voice once. I'm telling it now not to expose anyone, but to explain something I wish more people understood. Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's preparation. Have you ever been underestimated so completely that people didn't even realize you were watching? To them, I was safe. That's the word I would use now, looking back. Not impressive, not threatening, not ambitious in a way that required monitoring. I was solid, reliable, detail-oriented. The woman who would stay late to reconcile discrepancies no one else wanted to touch. The one who remembered version histories and policy revisions from 3 years ago. I was never the loudest in the room. I didn't need to be. In weekly executive meetings, I sat 2 seats from the end of the table, close enough to contribute, far enough not to dominate. When discussions turned heated, budgets, timelines, client escalations, I watched patterns instead of personalities. I noticed who interrupted whom, who took credit, who deflected blame. My manager, Daniel Whitmore, thrived in that environment. Daniel was charismatic in the way people mistake for competence. He spoke quickly, confidently, and always slightly louder than necessary. He summarized other people's work in polished language and made it sound strategic. Leadership loved that about him. He looked like momentum, and next to momentum, I looked like maintenance. He often introduced me as our compliance anchor or the backbone of documentation. It sounded complimentary, and maybe it was meant to be. But over time, I understood the subtext. Anchors don't steer ships, they keep them still. When projects succeeded, Daniel presented the outcomes. When something needed fixing quietly, I handled it. If there were inconsistencies in reporting, I resolved them before they reached his inbox. If there were security vulnerabilities, I flagged them privately. I told myself this was fine. I preferred precision to performance. Colleagues would stop by my desk with small favors. Can you double-check this before I send it? Can you review the access logs? I'm sure it's nothing. Can you make sure this is compliant so Daniel doesn't get upset? I rarely said no. Not because I lacked boundaries, but because I believed in protecting the integrity of our systems. If something was wrong, I fixed it. Quietly, efficiently. I built tracking sheets no one asked for. I archived emails. I documented process changes. I stored redundant backups, not out of paranoia, out of habit. Data tells stories, and I've always believed stories deserve preservation. But preservation doesn't make headlines. There's a particular invisibility that comes from being competent and calm at the same time. You become infrastructure. Necessary, but uncelebrated. Present, but unexamined. Daniel would occasionally joke, if Natalie ever left, we'd be in chaos for months. Everyone laughed. It sounded like appreciation. What it really meant was this: they never imagined I would leave, or fight, or refuse the role they had written for me. To them, I was predictable. I arrived early, left on time, rarely took sick days. I didn't socialize much after work, which made me seem private, maybe even distant. But I wasn't distant. I was observant. I knew who accessed what systems and when. I knew which reports were rushed. I knew which approvals were verbal instead of written. I knew which client contracts contained clauses that leadership hoped no one would reread. I also knew Daniel had started bypassing certain security protocols. Small things at first. Requests for broader administrative access are, temporarily, transfers of project files to external drives for off-site review, late-night logins from the office VPN that didn't align with scheduled work. I noted them, documented them, told myself there was probably a reasonable explanation, because that's who I was to them. Reasonable, calm, unthreatening. The kind of person who assumes good intent before suspecting misconduct. And that assumption, more than anything, was the version of me they relied on. They didn't realize I was changing. Not yet. The first time it happened, it was almost forgettable. That's how small cuts work. They don't demand attention. They test your tolerance. We were preparing documentation for a new enterprise client. Tight timeline, high stakes. I had spent 2 weeks auditing our internal access controls, restructuring the data retention policy, and compiling a risk assessment summary that made the entire proposal defensible. Daniel asked me to send him a clean version of my report the night before the executive review. The next morning, I sat in the conference room as he presented. He clicked through slides I recognized instantly. My structure, my language, even the phrasing of a sentence I'd rewritten 3 times to remove ambiguity. This framework, he said confidently, laser pointer steady, is something I've been refining for months. I remember the exact feeling, not shock, not anger, just a quiet pause inside my chest. No one looked at me, no one needed to. The room accepted the narrative as delivered, and I told myself it didn't matter. We were a team. He was my manager. Leadership often presents work compiled by others. That's how hierarchy functions. That's how visibility works. Still, something subtle shifted. After the meeting, one of the directors approached Daniel in the hallway. "Impressive clarity," she said. "This is the sharpest compliance framework we've had." Daniel smiled modestly. "I've been tightening the process." I was standing 3 feet away. He didn't correct her. He didn't mention me, and I didn't speak up. Later that afternoon, Daniel stopped by my desk. "Great groundwork," he said casually. "You're invaluable." Invaluable. It sounded generous, but it felt transactional, like a compliment designed to replace credit. I nodded and said, "I'm glad it helped." And that was it. No confrontation, no resentment. But that evening, before shutting down my computer, I did something new. I archived the original draft of the report with timestamps intact. I saved the metadata logs. I created a private folder labeled simply reference, not because I planned to use it, but because I no longer trusted the narrative to preserve itself. Over the next few weeks, similar moments accumulated. A slide deck I built that became Daniel's strategy outline, a client email I drafted that he forwarded as his summary, a security protocol I redesigned that was later introduced as a leadership initiative. Each time I rationalized it, he's positioning the department, he's protecting the team, he's speaking on behalf of all of us. But internally, I began noticing patterns. Credit traveled upward, responsibility traveled downward, and silence filled the space in between. No one else seemed bothered. In fact, some colleagues appeared relieved. As long as Daniel carried the spotlight, the rest of us could operate quietly. I used to believe quiet was neutral. Now I understand it could also be enabling. The first small cut wasn't the theft of recognition. It was the realization that my work could be reassigned without my consent, and the room would accept it without question. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me attentive. And attention, when sustained long enough, becomes power. The human mind is remarkably efficient at adaptation. If something uncomfortable happens once, it registers. If it happens twice, you question it. If it happens repeatedly without visible consequence, it starts to feel normal. That's how disrespect settles in. After the first few instances of Daniel presenting my work as his strategic insight, I adjusted. Not outwardly. No one would have noticed a change. But internally, I began lowering my expectations of acknowledgement. When emails went out summarizing project milestones, my name was often absent. When leadership praised Daniel's streamlined compliance model, I heard echoes of my spreadsheets and their compliments. But instead of resentment, I chose logic. He's the department head. Visibility flows through him. This is structural, not personal. That was the story I told myself. It helped that Daniel maintained a careful balance. He never dismissed me outright. In private, he was warm, appreciative, sometimes even deferential. "I couldn't do this without you," he would say. And I believed him, because I wasn't looking for credit. I was looking for stability. My work mattered more to me than my recognition. I cared about clean systems, secure access, and audit trails that could withstand scrutiny. The ego felt inefficient. But normalization has a cost. Gradually, meetings shifted in subtle ways. When technical questions arose, Daniel would answer them, even when the question was directed at me. "Natalie can clarify," someone would say. Daniel would respond first, sometimes correctly, sometimes partially. I would wait for a pause that never came. If I interjected, it felt like a correction. If I stayed silent, it felt like compliance. So I started choosing my moments carefully. Only when an answer was materially wrong did I speak. And when I did, I kept it neutral. To add context, or for accuracy, never confrontational, never personal. The room rarely registered the correction. They registered Daniel. Once, after a vendor call where I clarified a misstatement about encryption protocols, Daniel messaged me privately. "You don't need to jump in like that. It makes it seem like we're not aligned." Aligned. I reread that word 3 times. We weren't misaligned, we were inaccurate. But I responded with, "Understood." That was the moment I realized something important. Accuracy was my priority. Alignment was his. And in organizations driven by optics, alignment often wins. The more I adjusted to preserve harmony, the more my presence faded in perception. I became the internal safety net, present but uncredited, precise but peripheral. Colleagues began coming to me with a certain tone. "Can you fix this before Daniel sees it? Can you clean this up so it sounds more strategic?" Not because they doubted my authority, because they knew I would absorb the friction quietly. It wasn't malice, it was convenient. And I allowed it, not out of weakness, out of patience. I wanted to believe that competence speaks for itself, that consistency eventually becomes undeniable. What I didn't yet understand was this: competence without boundaries invites consumption. By the time I recognized the pattern fully, the normalization was complete. Daniel wasn't stealing moments anymore. He was occupying them by default. And I was facilitating that occupation by staying reasonable. Still, something inside me had shifted. I stopped assuming oversight. I started assuming risk. Every file I created was backed up twice. Every significant revision logged. Every unusual system access is documented. Not because I anticipated conflict, but because I had begun to see something else emerging beneath the surface. Disrespect doesn't escalate loudly. It escalates quietly, until one day it needs a scapegoat. And by then, the groundwork has already been laid. There's a moment in every professional dynamic when you realize you've been cast. Not hired, cast. The realization didn't arrive dramatically. It came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon during a quarterly planning session. Leadership was discussing expansion, new clients, broader data integration, and increased automation. Ambitious projections filled the screen: growth curves, market positioning, competitive edge. Daniel spoke confidently about scalability. And then he said something that clarified everything. "Natalie will make sure it's all compliant. She always does." The room nodded, satisfied. It was meant as reassurance. But what I heard was a limitation. In that sentence, my future had been defined. I wasn't strategic. I wasn't innovative. I wasn't visionary. I was contained, the safety mechanism that allowed others to take risks. There's nothing wrong with being reliable. Reliability builds institutions. But when reliability becomes your entire identity in the eyes of others, it narrows the perception of your capacity. From that day forward, I noticed how conversations flowed around me. When ideas were bold, I was the checkpoint. When deadlines were unrealistic, I was the stabilizer. When mistakes occurred, I was the cleaner. I was never considered for visibility projects, never asked to present at conferences, never invited into early-stage strategy sessions where real influence is shaped. Not because I wasn't capable, because I was predictable. And predictability is comfortable. Daniel leaned into that comfort. He began delegating increasingly complex back-end responsibilities to me while positioning himself as the face of innovation. He would describe initiatives as collaborative, but decision-making rarely included me at inception. If I raised concerns, they were framed as risk management. If he introduced ambitious changes, they were framed as leadership. Over time, colleagues began interacting with me through that lens. "You'll keep us safe, right? You'll flag anything that could get us in trouble?" I had become the quiet insurance policy. Useful, necessary, invisible. The irony was that I wasn't risk-averse by nature. I simply believed in informed action. But perception overrides nuance. And once a role is assigned, it becomes self-reinforcing. When you consistently solve problems quietly, people assume you prefer the shadows. When you don't compete for recognition, they assume you don't want it. When you remain composed under pressure, they assume you're unaffected. But composure is not the absence of awareness. One evening, after everyone had left, I stayed behind reviewing system access logs. A routine habit. I noticed Daniel had requested expanded administrative privileges again. The justification was vague. Operational efficiency. It was approved without question, because he was a leader, and I was compliant. I stared at the approval timestamp longer than necessary. For the first time, I asked myself a question I hadn't allowed before. What happens when this person with visibility also controls the narrative? And what happens to the person responsible for oversight if something goes wrong? That was the role I had been assigned. Guardian without authority, accountable without visibility, trusted but not empowered. And roles like that are stable until they aren't. Because when systems fail, the invisible infrastructure is often blamed first, not the architect, the anchor. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during an argument or a dramatic confrontation. It happened at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night. I wasn't in the office. I was at home, half reading a book, half listening to the quiet hum of my apartment. My laptop was open. Not because I was working, but because I had developed the habit of occasionally checking system alerts before bed. Not obsessively, just attentively. That night, a routine notification appeared. External storage device detected on secured workstation. The workstation ID was mine. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. I hadn't been in the office since 6:12 p.m. My access badge logs would confirm that. My desktop computer was locked when I left. Standard procedure. I refreshed the log. The external device had been connected for 9 minutes. 9 precise minutes. Then safely ejected. My first instinct wasn't fear. It was clarity, because unlike earlier patterns, the credit shifts, the subtle dismissals, this wasn't perception. This was data. I logged into the remote security dashboard and pulled the camera grid. We had internal security coverage in common areas and entry points, not inside individual offices. But the hallway outside my workspace was visible. At 11:41 p.m., Daniel's access badge opened the floor door. He walked down the hallway calmly. No urgency, no hesitation. At 11:44, he stopped at my office. The camera couldn't see inside. At 11:54, he exited, holding nothing visible in his hands. At 11:56, he left the building. I didn't react immediately. I didn't call anyone. I didn't confront him. Instead, I did what I always do. I documented. I exported the access logs, saved the timestamps, captured still frames from the hallway footage, archived the device connection report. Then I sat back in my chair and allowed the weight of the moment to settle. There are moments in life when something you've suspected abstractly becomes undeniable. This was one of them. Daniel hadn't asked for my files. He hadn't requested shared access. He had physically accessed my workstation after hours and connected an external device. There are very few innocent explanations for that. And yet, I didn't assume theft. I assumed preparation. Because people who move at midnight aren't improvising. They're positioning. For the first time, the earlier patterns reorganized themselves in my mind. Not as ego, not as convenience, but as groundwork. Expanded administrative privileges, narrative control in meetings, subtle discouragement when I corrected inaccuracies, late-night VPN logins. It was never about alignment. It was about consolidation. I closed my laptop and turned off the lights in my apartment. Sleep didn't come easily, but panic never arrived. Instead, something else settled in its place. Decision. I understood then that silence would no longer be passive. If I remained quiet now, it would have to be intentional, not avoidance. Strategy. Because if someone had accessed my workstation without authorization, there were only two possible outcomes. Either I confronted him immediately and forced the conflict into daylight, or I waited and learned why. The next morning, I arrived at the office exactly on time. I greeted Daniel the way I always did. "Good morning," he smiled. "Morning, Natalie." His expression was relaxed, controlled. He didn't know what I knew. And for the first time in our professional dynamic, that asymmetry belonged to me. Something had shifted, not externally, but internally. I was no longer infrastructure. I was leveraging. The morning after I saw the footage, I didn't act differently. That was the difference. Before, my silence had been habitual, reflexive, a byproduct of temperament. Now it was deliberate. I arrived at 8:15 a.m., placed my bag under my desk, and logged into my workstation. No visible disturbance. No files missing. If Daniel had copied anything, he'd done it carefully. Or selectively. I opened my calendar, 2 meetings with him that day. 1 project alignment, 1 compliance review. Ordinary. That's what composure does. It keeps the extraordinary disguised. When Daniel stepped into my office mid-morning, his tone was light. "Quick sync later?" he asked. "We may need to accelerate the new data migration plan." Accelerate? I studied his face for something. Guilt, tension, urgency. There was none. People assume wrongdoing announces itself emotionally. It doesn't. The calmest person in the room is often the most prepared. "Of course," I said, and I meant it. During our afternoon meeting, he outlined a proposal that felt familiar. Too familiar. The structure mirrored a framework I'd been drafting privately for months. An internal risk restructuring model I hadn't yet presented. He spoke about it confidently, strategically, as if it had always been his direction. I listened without interrupting. And in that listening, I felt something unexpected. Stillness. Not anger, not betrayal. Clarity, because now the midnight access made sense. If he was consolidating intellectual capital, absorbing the systems that gave me quite influence, he wasn't just borrowing ideas. He was preparing insulation. For what, I wasn't yet certain. But I recognized the pattern from security protocols. When someone centralizes control quietly, it's rarely for collaboration. It's for contingency. After the meeting, I returned to my desk and began auditing something new. Not him, not yet, but exposure. What files were exclusively stored locally? Which drafts were only traceable through my authorship? What documentation demonstrated the evolution of our compliance architecture? I created mirrored backups in encrypted archives. I forwarded key drafts to my secured personal repository. Not proprietary data, but evidence of authorship and timeline. I wasn't stealing. I was preserving. Over the next few days, I became even quieter. In meetings, I contributed only when necessary. I allowed Daniel to present expansions of his framework. I nodded when leadership praised the direction. And something subtle began to happen. The more silent I became, the more confidently he expanded. It's human nature. When resistance disappears, ambition grows. He requested broader system exports, asked IT for temporary elevated access to streamline transition, positioned himself as the architect of our next growth phase. No one questioned it. Why would they? He looked aligned, and I looked cooperative. But internally, I shifted from employee to observer. I began reviewing audit trails weekly instead of monthly. I mapped access overlaps. I saved meeting recordings. I documented who said what and when. Not obsessively, precisely. Silence, when chosen, creates space. And in that space, people reveal their trajectory. Daniel wasn't acting impulsively. He was building a narrative scaffold, which meant something significant was coming. People don't collect leverage without anticipating movement. I didn't know the timing yet, but I knew one thing with certainty. If an accusation ever surfaced, it would not be spontaneous. It would be pre-positioned. And the person who moves first in those situations usually controls the frame. So I prepared for that frame without announcing that I saw it forming. Preparation, when done correctly, looks like routine. That's why no one noticed. From the outside, I was still Natalie, the steady compliance lead who preferred spreadsheets to spotlights. I arrived on time. I left on time. I responded to emails promptly. I attended meetings without friction. But beneath that surface, I began constructing something far more durable than documentation. I built a chronology. In security work, context is everything. A single log entry means little. A pattern over time means intent. So I created a private timeline. Nothing dramatic, just a structured ledger of observable facts. Dates of expanded administrative access requests. Instances where my frameworks were presented without attribution. Late-night VPN logins tied to Daniel's credentials. The exact timestamp of the external drive connected to my workstation. Meeting notes where strategic pivots aligned suspiciously with files I had drafted. Each entry was unemotional, factual, verifiable. I wasn't building a case. I was building clarity. There's a psychological advantage in that. When events are organized chronologically, they lose their chaos. They become architecture. And architecture reveals design. Over the following weeks, Daniel accelerated initiatives aggressively. He began leading cross-department presentations, speaking about streamlining oversight redundancies. He suggested consolidating certain compliance checkpoints under his authority to reduce friction. It was subtle language, but I heard the translation. Fewer witnesses, more control. He also started asking me for broader data exports, summaries of access histories, archived policy drafts, risk mitigation projections. I complied, but I stopped sending originals. Instead, I shared formatted summaries while preserving raw source files in secure storage. Every document transmitted was logged, every version tracked. I also requested something new from IT. Under the guise of preparing for an upcoming external audit, I asked for system-level access reports covering the past 6 months, not just user activity, approval chains, who granted what, and when. No one questioned the request. Audits justify visibility. When the report arrived, the pattern tightened. Daniel had personally approved several of his own temporary access extensions, not illegally, but irregularly. The approvals bypassed secondary verification steps that normally triggered review. Again, not dramatic, just intentional. At this point, some people might imagine confrontation, a tense conversation, an accusation delivered calmly across a desk. But confrontation without timing is noise, and I still didn't know the full scope of his move. So I widened my lens. I scheduled a quiet consultation with an external data compliance attorney, purely hypothetical, framed as general best practices. I didn't mention names, I described scenarios: unauthorized workstation access, internal narrative manipulation, and preemptive accusations. The attorney's response was simple. In situations where misconduct may be reframed as whistleblowing or theft, documentation and sequence determine outcome. Whoever files first often controls perception. Files first. The phrase stayed with me. Back at work, I observed something else shift. Daniel began limiting one-on-one discussions, fewer spontaneous check-ins, more formal meeting invites with others copied. It wasn't distance. It was insulation. He was creating witnesses, and that confirmed it. Something formal was coming. I returned to the hallway, footage from that Thursday night, and reviewed it again. Slowed it down, enhanced timestamps, verified badge logs against security records. Everything aligned. He had accessed my workstation. He had connected an external device, and he had left without reporting it. There are only 2 reasons a manager touches an employee's secured system after midnight: emergency or strategy. There had been no emergency. By the end of that month, my timeline document had grown to 17 pages. 17 pages of neutral facts. I didn't feel angry while compiling them. I felt steady, because what they never noticed about me was this. I don't move when I'm emotional. I move when I'm certain. And certainty was almost complete. All that remained was the trigger. The reveal didn't happen in a room full of executives. It happened alone, in the quiet glow of my monitor, 3 weeks after the midnight access. Up until then, I had evidence of intrusion, evidence of a pattern, evidence of consolidation. But evidence of motive is different. Motive requires context. The context arrived disguised as urgency. Daniel scheduled a confidential alignment meeting with me late on a Friday afternoon. The calendar description was vague. Strategic risk discussion. No one else invited. When I walked into his office, he closed the door gently. His tone was measured, professional. "There's been a concern raised," he began, folding his hands on the desk. "Unusual data export activity tied to compliance repositories." "I didn't move," he continued. "Specifically, large structured downloads over the past quarter. It's likely nothing, but given your access level, I wanted to clarify before escalating." Clarify. There it was. The architecture had matured. He wasn't accusing me outright. Not yet. He was planting documentation of concern, establishing that he had asked. The irony almost impressed me. The data exports he referenced were legitimate audit compilations I had prepared at leadership's request, all properly logged, all within my role. But his phrasing reframed them as suspicious volume. "I can walk you through every export," I said calmly. "They were generated for the Q2 external review." He nodded slowly, as if weighing the explanation. "I figured," he replied. "Still, optics matter. We need to be careful about how the activity looks on paper." Optics! He was rehearsing a narrative. That meeting told me 2 things. First, he was preparing documentation that would position him as vigilant. Second, he believed I didn't know about the midnight access. When I returned to my desk, I didn't feel threatened. I felt aligned with reality. I reopened the administrative access report from IT and filtered by system-level external device recognition events. There were very few. Most employees used cloud storage exclusively. But one detail stood out. The external device connected to my workstation at 11:47 p.m. had a unique hardware ID. That ID had appeared once before, 2 weeks earlier, connected to Daniel's assigned office desktop during business hours. That wasn't a coincidence. It meant the same physical drive had been used on both systems. And unlike hallway footage, device IDs don't interpret themselves. They either match or they don't. I exported the report, saved it alongside the footage stills, added a cross-reference note in my chronology. Now I had something different. Not suspicion, correlation. That evening, I made a decision quietly. I scheduled a meeting with HR, not to file a complaint, not yet. I scheduled it under the pretext of clarifying data governance, accountability boundaries, in preparation for upcoming audits. During the conversation, I asked neutral to structured questions. If a manager accesses a subordinate's workstation after hours, what documentation is required? If an employee believes their system credentials were used without consent, what's the reporting pathway? HR answered factually, policy-driven, no alarm triggered. But the responses confirmed something critical. Unauthorized after-hours access, without documented justification, violated internal security protocol. And if coupled with subsequent allegations of data misuse, it could be construed as retaliatory positioning. Retaliatory positioning. The phrase settled heavily. By the end of that week, I understood the full design. Daniel wasn't stealing for innovation. He was insulating himself from accusation. If proprietary models or strategic documents surfaced externally, or if leadership questioned structural inconsistencies, he needed a plausible origin for irregularities. And who had both system access and low visibility? Me. The thief had already begun building the complaint. He just hadn't filed it yet. That was the private reveal. Not explosive, not cinematic, just a quiet, devastating clarity. And in that clarity, I realized something that changed everything. Whoever speaks first shapes the story. And for the first time in my career, I considered speaking first. There are moments when you can still walk away quietly. And there are moments when walking away ensures you'll be followed by a narrative you didn't write. I stood at that intersection for 3 days. Option 1 was simple. Confront Daniel directly. Present the hallway footage. The device ID correlation. Watch his reaction. Force a private reckoning. But confrontation without witnesses can be reframed. Denied. Softened into misunderstanding. Option 2. Escalate formally. File a report detailing unauthorized workstation access and irregular administrative approvals. But if I filed prematurely, he could counter, position my report as defensive, emotional, reactionary. Because the truth I had finally accepted was this. The thief filed the complaint before I could. He just hadn't pressed send yet. The Friday clarification meeting wasn't casual. It was documentation groundwork. A timestamp showing he had raised concerns about my data exports. A precursor. He was constructing a paper trail that would make my actions appear suspicious in hindsight. That's how strategic accusations work. They're seeded early. So I asked myself the only question that mattered. If he plans to accuse me of data misuse, What evidence would he rely on? Large exports, high-level access. Strategic documents are tied to my workstation. And if leadership received a complaint alleging I had been extracting proprietary models for external use, what would they do first? Audit my activity. Not his, because he was a leader, and I was infrastructure. That was the asymmetry. Unless I changed it, the irreversible option wasn't confrontation, it was preemption. On Monday morning, before anyone else arrived, I scheduled a formal meeting with our chief risk officer and HR. Subject line, security protocol disclosure, immediate. I attached nothing. Inside the meeting invite, I wrote only one sentence. I need to report a potential breach involving my workstation and request an independent review. That was it. No accusations, no names, just process. When I walked into that conference room 2 hours later, I carried a single encrypted drive. Inside it, hallway security stills with timestamps, badge access logs confirming Daniel's after-hours entry, external device hardware ID correlation report, administrative approval chains showing self-authorization patterns, the timeline I had built over months, 17 pages of neutral chronology. I didn't open with emotion. I opened with the sequence. At 11:47 p.m. on March 14th, I began calmly. An external storage device was connected to my secured workstation. I was not present in the building. I let the timestamp speak. I didn't accuse Daniel of theft. I stated verifiable facts. And then I added one more line. Given a recent internal inquiry regarding my data exports, I believe it's critical that this review be conducted before any formal complaint is filed. The room shifted slightly at that phrasing. Before any formal complaint is filed. They understood what it implied. I had moved first, not to attack, to define. Because once an accusation is formalized, perception crystallizes around it. But if the sequence is established beforehand, if the narrative begins with unauthorized access instead of suspicious export, the frame changes. I didn't feel triumphant leaving that meeting. I felt steady. Irreversibility isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It's the moment you choose transparency, knowing it may detonate someone else's plan. By the end of that day, the internal audit had initiated a system-level investigation. Daniel didn't know yet, but the window for his complaint had closed, and he hadn't even realized it was his last chance. If you've never witnessed a corporate investigation begin, it doesn't look like much. There are no announcements, no visible panic, no dramatic summons. It looks like routine. System access reviews. Quiet calendar invites. IT is pulling back-end logs under the language of standard audit reconciliation. And that was the point. After my disclosure meeting, I returned to my desk and worked exactly as I always had. I answered emails, reviewed compliance updates, attended the weekly operations call without deviation in tone. Daniel was on that call, confident, articulate, unaware. Internal audit had asked me not to discuss the disclosure. Standard protocol. Preserve the integrity of the review. Silence once again became strategic. Over the next 48 hours, subtle shifts began appearing. IT temporarily restricted administrative privilege extensions, company-wide, pending verification. That directly affected Daniel's expanded access. He sent a brief message in the leadership channel. Looks like system controls are being tightened. Minor inconvenience, but we'll adapt. Minor inconvenience. I read it twice, then continued working. Later that afternoon, audit requested a copy of all documentation tied to recent compliance exports, specifically the large data compilations Daniel had referenced in our private meeting. I provided them with full metadata trails, timestamps, request emails from executives authorizing each report. Sequence matters. When the sequence is clean, suspicion dissolves. What audit did next was outside my visibility, but I could infer the trajectory. They would review who accessed my workstation after hours, whether that access was documented, whether the external device connection is aligned with policy, whether any data from my machine had been transferred to unauthorized locations. They would also review approval chains, and those chains were no longer abstract patterns in my private timeline. They were institutional records. On Thursday morning, Daniel stopped by my desk. "Quick question," he said casually. "Have you heard anything about an internal audit sweep?" His tone was neutral, curious. I met his gaze evenly. "I've seen the IT notice about access reviews." He studied me for a fraction longer than usual. "They're being thorough," he said. "They should be," I replied. No accusation, no edge, just an agreement. What he didn't know was that I had also taken an additional precaution. After consulting the external compliance attorney, I had drafted a sealed memorandum documenting the entire chronology, from the first instance of uncredited framework presentation to the midnight workstation access. It was time-stamped and lodged with counsel, not as a lawsuit, not as escalation, but as protection. If narrative manipulation intensified, there would be an external record predating any internal accusation. That's the part most people miss about quiet dominance. It isn't reactive. It's layered. By Friday afternoon, the audit scheduled formal interviews. Mine was first. Again, sequence. They asked structured questions. I answered factually. No speculation, no emotion. When they inquired whether I believed any colleague had accessed my workstation without authorization, I responded carefully. I can confirm that my badge logs show I was not present. The hallway footage and device ID reports speak for themselves. I didn't say Daniel's name. I didn't need to. Evidence carries identity without commentary. When I left that interview room, something inside me settled fully. The mechanism had engaged. And unlike an accusation built on framing, this process was built on verification. No one in the broader department knew what was unfolding. Meetings continued, projects advanced, but beneath the surface, the architecture of narrative control had shifted. Because the first documented event in this sequence was no longer Natalie's suspicious data exports. It was unauthorized after-hours access to Natalie's workstation. And that difference changes everything. Consequences don't always arrive as explosions. Sometimes they arrive with hesitation. The first visible shift happened the following Monday. Daniel was scheduled to present the finalized, streamlined oversight model to senior leadership, the same framework that had evolved from my drafts. 30 minutes before the meeting, the calendar invite was updated. Presenter, pending audit clearance. That was new. No explanation, just a procedural adjustment. In the conference room, the atmosphere felt almost identical to previous strategy sessions. Same polished table, same filtered light, same measured tones. But something subtle was missing. Momentum. Daniel opened with confidence, but there was a slight recalibration in his language. Pending final verification from internal audit, we're proposing... Pending. Verification. Words he rarely used before. I watched carefully. Not with satisfaction, but with observation. When one director asked about administrative access consolidation, Daniel paused for half a second longer than usual. That's currently under review, he said. We're ensuring all protocols align with policy. Alignment again. Only this time, he wasn't protecting the narrative. He was protecting position. After the meeting, whispers began. Not dramatic, not accusatory, just curious. Why is audit reviewing compliance? Is there a client issue? Did something trigger a report? No one asked me directly, and I didn't offer anything. That afternoon, IT implemented a temporary freeze on external device connections across all secured workstations, effective immediately. Official reason? Policy reinforcement? Unofficial meaning someone had used one. Daniel's door remained closed for most of the day. Mine remained open. By midweek, audit had expanded interviews beyond me. A few team members mentioned casually that they'd been asked about workflow processes and document authorship. One colleague stopped by my desk. Hey, random question, she said lightly. Who originally drafted the risk restructuring model? Audit asked about version history. I looked at her calmly. I did. She blinked once, processing. Oh, no accusation, just recalibration. That's how perception shifts, not with declarations, but with small confirmations. Later that afternoon, I received a brief email from the Chief Risk Officer. Thank you for your transparency and documentation. We are reviewing additional findings. Transparency, documentation. Two things I had been told, indirectly, subtly, were unnecessary complications. Now they were stabilizers. Daniel's behavior changed incrementally. He stopped referencing his framework in meetings. He deferred more frequently. He began using collective language where he previously used singular ownership. Our team has been developing. We're ensuring pronouns reveal pressure. By Friday, the atmosphere in the department felt restrained. Not fearful, just measured. And here's the part that surprised me. No one treated me differently. No congratulations. No knowing looks. No quiet alliances forming. Because they didn't yet understand the full picture. They only sensed that something had shifted in the power geometry. When someone who usually dominates begins hedging language, people feel it. They don't know why, but they feel it. That evening, as I packed my bag, Daniel stepped into my doorway. Natalie, he said, voice even, audit can be disruptive. Let me know if you need support navigating any of their questions. Support. The word hovered between us. I'm comfortable with the process, I replied. He studied me carefully. For the first time since I'd known him, I saw uncertainty. Not panic, just a calculation was disrupted. Consequences rarely look like punishment at first. They look like a loss of certainty. And Daniel had begun losing his. Panic doesn't always show on someone's face. Sometimes it shows in their attempts to rewind. The official findings from internal audit were not announced in a dramatic meeting. They were distributed in controlled layers. First, administrative privileges were formally restructured. No single department head could approve their own extensions anymore. Dual authorization became mandatory. Second, after-hours workstation access required written justification logged within 12 hours, or it triggered automatic escalation. Third, external storage devices were permanently disabled across all compliance terminals. Policy reinforcement. That's what the email said, but policies don't tighten without precedent. By midweek, Daniel requested a private meeting, not through a calendar invite with vague phrasing, directly, in person. "Do you have a few minutes?" he asked. His voice was steady, but his posture wasn't as relaxed as before. Inside his office, he closed the door. "I've been informed that audit is reviewing an after-hours access event tied to your workstation," he began. "Tied to, not caused by." I remained quiet. He continued, choosing words carefully. "There may have been a misunderstanding. I was conducting a late review session and accessed multiple terminals to verify version control alignment." Multiple terminals. It was an expansion of scope, diffusing specificity. "I didn't realize that required separate documentation," he added. I watched him. The man who once filled rooms effortlessly was now negotiating phrasing in a closed office. "I appreciate the clarification," I said evenly. "Audit has the access logs and device reports. They'll determine alignment." The word landed softly. Alignment. His jaw tightened slightly. "You didn't come to me first," he said. There it was. Not denial, not anger, regret. "I followed policy," I replied, and silence stretched between us. In that silence, something irreversible became visible. He understood that I had moved first. He also understood that once documentation enters formal channels, it cannot be recontained through conversation. "You know how this looks," he said quietly. "Yes," I answered. And I did. It looked like unauthorized access, followed by an attempt to frame export activity as suspicious. Even if he never formally filed the complaint he had begun constructing, the sequence now worked against him. The thief filed the complaint before I could. But he underestimated one variable. I knew he would. By Friday, leadership adjusted reporting lines, temporarily pending structural review. Daniel's oversight of compliance was reduced. Direct executive review increased. No public reprimand, no spectacle. Just the removal of unilateral control. That's how organizations correct without humiliating. The atmosphere around him changed subtly. Colleagues spoke more cautiously. Directors requested written confirmations instead of verbal approvals. Trust had thinned. And once trust thins, authority softens. Late that afternoon, as I finalized a quarterly compliance brief, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, relief, because the fear that had lingered quietly, the possibility of being blindsided by a formal accusation, was gone. Even if Daniel attempted to file something now, the chronology would precede him. The narrative frame had shifted permanently. Too late to fix it doesn't mean destruction. It means the sequence has solidified. And sequence, once documented, that doesn't bend. As I shut down my computer that evening, I realized something simple. The most destabilizing thing you can do to someone preparing to accuse you is tell the truth first. The final conversation happened 2 weeks later. By then, internal audit had concluded its formal review. I wasn't given every detail. That's not how corporate investigations work. But I was informed of the outcome relevant to me. No evidence of unauthorized data export. Confirmed after-hours access to my workstation by Daniel without documented justification. Policy violation. Administrative action taken. Administrative action? It's a sterile phrase. It covers a wide range of consequences. What mattered wasn't the penalty. It was the record. Daniel requested one last meeting. This time the invitation was formal. HR copied. We sat across from each other in a neutral conference room. No raised voices, no witnesses beyond policy. HR opened with procedural language about closing the loop and restoring professional alignment. Then they left us alone for a final discussion. Daniel didn't look angry. He looked tired. "I miscalculated," he said quietly. It was the closest he had come to admission. I didn't respond immediately. He continued. "I was under pressure. The board wanted acceleration. I needed visibility on your models. I thought if I consolidated oversight, it would simplify everything." Consolidated oversight. That was one way to describe copying someone's hard drive at midnight. "You were going to file a complaint," I said. "Not as an accusation, but as an observation." He didn't deny it. "There were irregular export volumes," he replied. "It would have raised questions eventually." Questions. That's how accusations begin. Under the guise of inquiry. "You were preparing documentation before the audit-initiated review," I added calmly. A pause. Yes, there it was. Not villainy, not shouting, just confirmation of the sequence. "I didn't think you would escalate," he said finally. Escalate. The word carried an assumption that protecting oneself is aggression. "I followed policy," I repeated. Silence again. But the silence felt different from the others we'd shared over the years. This one wasn't about power imbalance. It was about clarity. "I never intended for it to become adversarial," he said. I believed him. Not because his actions were harmless, but because most strategic harm doesn't feel malicious to the person committing it. It feels necessary. "You assigned me a role," I said gently. "Reliable, invisible, containment." He looked at me more directly then. "I trusted you," he said. "And I trusted the system," I replied. That was the difference. He trusted perception. I trusted the documentation. There was no apology that would rewrite the chronology. No defense that would undo the footage, the device ID, the timeline. But there was something else, recognition. You're not who I thought you were, he admitted. I am, I said. You just didn't look closely. The conversation ended without raised voices, without humiliation, without victory declared, just acknowledgement of miscalculation. When I walked out of that room, I didn't feel powerful. I felt accurate, and accuracy, sustained long enough, becomes its own form of dominance. People assume events like this change you dramatically. They expect reinvention, sharp edges, hardened tone. That didn't happen. What changed wasn't my personality. It was my perimeter. In the months following the investigation, the company restructured reporting lines permanently. Compliance no longer sat quietly beneath operations. It became a direct advisory arm to executive leadership. I was offered the role, not as consolation, as recognition. For the first time in my career, I was invited into early-stage strategy sessions, not to clean up ideas, but to shape them. The irony wasn't lost on me. I hadn't fought for visibility. I had insisted on the process. Daniel transitioned into a different division shortly after. Not publicly disgraced, not dramatically removed, just repositioned. We haven't spoken since that final meeting, and I don't carry bitterness, because this was never about defeating him. It was about refusing invisibility when it became dangerous. Here's what I understand now that I didn't before. Being underestimated is neutral until someone weaponizes it. Silence is powerful until it protects the wrong person. Reliability is respected until it becomes assumed. I still arrive early. I still document everything. I still prefer calm rooms over loud ones. But there's a difference. I spoke earlier, not emotionally, structurally. If a narrative begins forming that misrepresents the process, I correct it in real time. If access boundaries blur, I clarify them immediately. If my work is presented, authorship is documented, not for ego, but for integrity. There's a steadiness that comes from knowing you can defend your truth without raising your voice. And there's a different kind of confidence that comes from having already survived miscalculation. The woman they once described as safe is still here, but safe no longer means convenient. It means precise. It means anchored in evidence. It means unmovable when the sequence matters. Sometimes people ask me, quietly, how I remain so composed through it all. The answer is simple. I never saw it as a fight. I saw it as alignment between reality and record. When those two match, you don't need aggression. You need patience. I don't resent Daniel for what happened. In a strange way, he revealed something valuable to me. If you don't define your role, someone else will. And if you don't protect your authorship, someone else may attempt to inherit it. I am still Natalie, 36, calm, observant. But now when I sit at the conference table, I no longer occupy the seat near the end. Not because I demanded it, because the room adjusted, and I let it. When people hear this story, they often expect me to say, I felt vindicated. I proved something. That justice felt satisfying. But the truth is quieter than that. Justice, when it's clean, doesn't feel explosive. It feels stable. No one applauded. No dramatic emails were sent. There was no public acknowledgement of what almost happened. There was only one sequence, and the sequence protected me. If there's a lesson here, it isn't about catching someone in the act. It isn't about revenge or exposing wrongdoing in a blaze of triumph. It's about documentation. It's about understanding that power often hides behind narrative control. And the person who files first, who frames the situation first, usually shapes perception. The thief filed the complaint before I could. He just didn't expect that I had already filed the truth. Quietly, formally, irreversibly. And that's the part I want to leave you with. You don't have to shout to defend yourself. You don't have to humiliate someone to correct them. You don't have to become cruel to become protected. Sometimes, the strongest move is simply to tell the truth before someone else tells a version of it for you. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever felt invisible in a room that depended on your competence, if you've ever sensed a narrative forming around you that didn't quite feel right, pause, document, clarify, and move before you're moved, because silence is powerful, but only when it's chosen. I'm curious, have you ever experienced a moment where someone tried to define your story before you had the chance to speak? I'd really like to hear how you handled it.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.